For 22 years, Johnny Carson sat behind the most powerful desk in American television, and the guests who earned his approval could watch their careers change overnight. But there was one guest, one comedian, one woman he had personally discovered and mentored for 2 decades, who crossed him so badly that he never spoke to her again for the rest of his life. She wasn't banned for a stunt gone wrong, or a joke that landed poorly, or a wardrobe malfunction. She was banned for daring to build something of her own. This is the story of Joan Rivers, the woman Johnny Carson turned into a star, and a single decision that turned her into a ghost on the network that made her famous. To understand how devastating the fallout was, you first have to understand how close these two people actually were. Joan Rivers wasn't just another comic who happened to get a few good bookings on The Tonight Show. She was, for a long stretch of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, arguably the most important person in Johnny Carson's professional orbit outside of Carson himself. Their relationship began in 1965, when a 31-year-old Rivers, still years away from national stardom, walked out onto Carson's stage for the first time. She killed. Carson, not exactly known for effusive praise, reportedly told her on air that she was going to be a star, and from that single appearance, everything in her career started to shift. Bookers started calling. Audiences started remembering her name. A relationship was born that would define the next 2 decades of her professional life, for better and eventually for much worse. Rivers spent the following years building a reputation as one of the sharpest, most fearless voices in American comedy. Someone who talked openly about subjects that other female performers of her era were expected to avoid entirely. Aging, marriage, body image, ambition, and her own insecurities, all filtered through a rapid-fire delivery and a catchphrase that became a piece of pop culture in itself. Can we talk? But no matter how big she got on her own, the Carson relationship remained the backbone of her career. He had her on as a guest dozens of times throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, and by the early 1980s, she had become his most trusted substitute, someone who could sit behind that desk when he wasn't there and keep the show running exactly the way audiences expected it to run. In 1983, that arrangement became official. NBC, worried about a new syndicated competitor threatening Carson's dominance in the late-night ratings, needed a way to keep Tonight feeling fresh on the nights Carson wasn't hosting. Their solution was to lock Rivers in as the show's first-ever permanent guest host, a title that had never existed before in the show's history. It was, in effect, an anointing. Rivers wasn't just a funny woman who occasionally filled in. She was now formally recognized as Johnny Carson's second-in-command, the only person NBC trusted enough to hand the keys to America's most valuable television franchise. For a comedian who had clawed her way up through smoky clubs and rejection after rejection earlier in her career, it was the validation of a lifetime. She told reporters at the time that nobody could ever really match Johnny Carson, and by every indication, she meant it. She still deferred to him as the master of the format, even while sitting in his chair. For the next 3 years, Rivers hosted Tonight regularly, developed her own rapport with the show's audience, and continued positioning herself as the heir apparent to the most coveted seat in television. And that phrase, heir apparent, is really the crux of everything that happened next. Because in the entertainment industry, being treated like the successor and actually being named the successor are 2 very different things, and the gap between those 2 realities is where this entire story lives. By the middle of the 1980s, speculation had begun swirling that Carson, who had been hosting the show since 1962, might finally step away once he hit his 25th anniversary in 1987. It was a natural, symbolic stopping point, and NBC executives, always thinking several steps ahead, began quietly discussing who might eventually take over. According to multiple accounts from people close to the situation, a confidential internal memo began circulating at NBC in the spring of 1986, listing roughly 10 potential successors to Carson's chair. Word of the memo leaked to the press, as these things almost always do, and when Rivers finally got a look at the list, she found something that shook her. Her own name wasn't on it. For a woman who had spent 3 years as the network's official Carson substitute, who had built her national identity around being the second most trusted person on that stage, this was more than professional slight. It was a signal. It told her, in the coldest possible corporate language, that no matter how loyal she had been, no matter how many nights she had carried the show in Carson's absence, NBC did not see her future tied to that desk. She had reportedly turned down other opportunities over the years, specifically because she believed her patience with Tonight would eventually be rewarded. Now it looked like it wouldn't be. At almost exactly the same time, a brand new player was entering the television landscape, and was hungry for exactly the kind of star power Rivers represented. Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation was assembling what would become the Fox Broadcasting Company, a fourth major network built from scratch to compete with the established giants. Fox needed something splashy to announce its arrival, something that would grab headlines and force affiliates around the country to pay attention. A Barry Diller-led team at the fledgling network approached Rivers in early 1986 with an offer that must have felt like poetic justice. Her own late-night show, going head-to-head against the very program that had just quietly passed her over. It's worth pausing here to sit with how tempting that offer must have been. Rivers wasn't just being offered a job. She was being offered the exact validation NBC had refused to put in writing. A network was willing to build an entire late-night launch strategy around her name. She would no longer be the permanent guest host, filling in for someone else's show. She would be the star of her own. And here's where the story takes its fatal turn, the moment that would define the rest of her relationship with Johnny Carson. According to Rivers' own later account, published years afterward in a personal essay, she tried to reach Carson directly to tell him about the Fox deal before it became public. She has said that she called him, that the call did not go the way she hoped, and that from that point forward, he refused to acknowledge that the conversation had ever taken place. Carson's camp, and much of the reporting from that era, told a different version, one where Rivers accepted the Fox job and let Carson learn about it secondhand, through industry gossip and press leaks, rather than a phone call from the person he trusted with his own show for 3 years. Whichever version is closer to the truth, and the two people who knew for certain took most of the details to their graves, the result was identical. Johnny Carson felt blindsided, and he felt betrayed by someone had spent 2 decades building up. For a man whose entire professional identity was built on control, on precision, on knowing exactly what was going to happen on his stage down to the second, being caught off guard by his own protege was close to unforgivable. Carson did not respond quietly. He made his fury public and permanent. Rivers was informed she would never appear on The Tonight Show again, and Carson made it clear that the ban extended beyond just her. Any performer who chose to appear on Rivers' new Fox program would find themselves unwelcome on a stage as well, a policy that instantly made booking A-list guests for her competing show an uphill battle before it had even aired a single episode. The severing was immediate and total. Gary Shandling, a young comedian who had appeared as a guest host himself, was brought in to help fill the guest hosting void Rivers left behind. Within weeks, it was as though 3 years of history had simply been erased from the show's institutional memory. There was no farewell episode, no gracious send-off acknowledging everything Rivers had contributed. The most trusted substitute host in the program's history vanished from its rotation entirely, and neither side seemed interested in pretending otherwise. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers premiered on Fox on October 9, 1986, with genuine fanfare. Elton John performed the show's theme song live for the launch, and the moment was billed as historic. The first time a major network built a late-night talk show around a woman as its host. For one night, it must have felt like vindication, like proof that walking away from Carson's shadow had been the right call after all. That feeling did not last. Almost immediately, the new show ran into problems that had nothing to do with Rivers' talent and everything to do with the ecosystem Carson still controlled. Because so many performers were unwilling to risk their standing with Tonight, Rivers found herself struggling to book the kind of marquee guests that made late-night television work. Local NBC affiliates, some out of genuine loyalty to Carson and some simply reading which way the industry wind was blowing, were reluctant to give Fox's new offering a fair shake. And in several markets, Rivers' show wasn't even carried on a station that could reach as many households as Carson's. Reviews at the time noted just how lopsided the playing field was in the very first broadcast, would her audience reach a fraction of what Tonight commanded on any given night. Behind the scenes, things were even messier. Rivers' husband, Edgar Rosenberg, served as an executive producer on the Fox show, and tensions between him and network executives escalated quickly as ratings failed to materialize the way Fox had hoped. When the network ultimately demanded that Rivers remove her husband from the production, She refused to do it, unwilling to sacrifice him to save her own position. Fox responded by firing them both. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers had lasted less than a year, canceled in the spring of 1987. Not even 9 months after its triumphant premiere, the show limped along afterward under a rotating cast of replacement hosts, including a young comedian named Arsenio Hall, who would later use the experience as a springboard to build his own successful late-night program. For Rivers, though, there was no silver lining waiting on the other side. She had walked away from the most secure position in American comedy to chase full ownership of her own show, and within a year, she had neither. The personal toll was even steeper than the professional one. The pressure of the failed show, combined with mounting financial strain and the collapse of relationships that had once defined her professional life, put enormous stress on her marriage. Less than a year after the Fox show's cancellation, Edgar Rosenberg took his own life, a tragedy that Rivers would later describe as one of the most devastating experiences of her entire life, compounded by grief she carried alongside very public professional humiliation. And through all of it, Johnny Carson said nothing. He didn't reach out during the show's collapse. He didn't reach out after Rosenberg's death. According to Rivers, every attempt she made in the years that followed to repair the relationship, to explain her side, to simply talk to a man who had once called her a star on national television, went completely unanswered. He had told her he would never speak to her again, and by every account from people who knew them both, that is precisely what happened. Not a single phone call. Not a single letter. Not so much as an acknowledgement that she existed for the rest of his life. It's worth sitting with just how unusual that level of finality was, even by the standards of Hollywood grudges. Feuds in entertainment are common, but they usually soften with time, especially after decades and especially after tragedy. Two people who had shared that much history, who had built careers alongside each other, who had genuinely liked one another by every outward appearance for the better part of 20 years, simply stopped existing to one another. Carson went on hosting Tonight for another 6 years after the Fox show collapsed, finally stepping down in May of 1992. And in all that time, he never once revisited the band, never brought Rivers back for so much as a farewell wave, and never publicly softened his position. When he passed away in 2005, the rupture was still exactly as complete as it had been the day he first heard about her competing show. Rivers, for her part, never stopped working and never stopped talking about what had happened, in interviews, in her stand-up, and eventually in her own writing. She was candid about how much the loss of that relationship had hurt her, describing the abruptness of Carson's silence as something she genuinely never understood. Even decades later, she rebuilt her career piece by piece in the years that followed, moving into fashion commentary, red carpet coverage, reality television, and a punishing stand-up schedule that never really slowed down, even as she moved into her 70s and then her 80s. She became, in many ways, an entirely new kind of institution, one built on resilience rather than on any single show or network relationship. The band itself outlived Carson by nearly a decade. When Jay Leno took over Tonight in 1992, he chose to honor Carson's original decision, and Rivers remained off the show throughout his entire 17-year run as host. When Conan O'Brien briefly held the chair after Leno's initial departure, the unofficial policy held there too. It wasn't until 2014, 28 years after the original falling out and 9 years after Carson's death, that Jimmy Fallon, newly installed as host, finally invited Joan Rivers back onto the Tonight Show stage. She was 80 years old by then, and characteristically, she turned even that moment into a joke about her own age, telling the audience that the last time she'd been on the show, her daughter Melissa had still been in diapers, and now she was the one who needed them. It was a warm, funny, bittersweet homecoming to a stage she hadn't set foot on since the Reagan administration, and it happened only because the man who had banned her was no longer around to object. Joan Rivers died just months later, in September of 2014, following complications from a medical procedure. That handful of months between her Tonight Show return and her death gave the story an ending that felt, if not entirely happy, at least complete. She had outlasted the band. She had outlasted the silence. She got to walk back onto the stage that had defined so much of her professional identity on her own terms, one final time, before the story closed for good. What makes this particular Hollywood rupture so enduringly fascinating isn't really the mechanics of who called whom, or which version of the phone call is more accurate. It's what the whole episode reveals about power, loyalty, and ambition in an industry built almost entirely on personal relationships rather than formal contracts. Rivers wasn't punished for being disloyal in any legal sense. She hadn't broken any agreement, hadn't violated any contract, hadn't done anything that would hold up as wrongdoing in a courtroom. She was punished, in the most old-fashioned sense of the word, for wanting something for herself that her mentor hadn't personally approved of first. Carson had built an empire on the idea that he alone decided who rose and who didn't within his orbit, and Rivers' decision to build her own platform, whether or not she handled the announcement with perfect diplomacy, was an implicit challenge to that authority. There's also something quietly revealing about gender and ambition buried inside this story. Rivers was, by any measure, one of the hardest working and most talented comedic minds of her generation, and yet even after 3 years as the network's officially sanctioned Carson substitute, she still wasn't considered a serious contender to eventually inherit the chair itself. She has spoken candidly over the years about how much that stung, about the particular sting of being treated as indispensable in a moment, but disposable in the long-term plan. Her choice to leap toward the Fox opportunity wasn't just about competing with Carson. It was about refusing to spend another decade waiting for a permission slip that might never come. Looking back on it now, decades removed from the original headlines, it's tempting to wonder what might have happened if either of them had handled that initial conversation differently, if Carson had reacted with less finality, if Rivers had found a gentler way to deliver the news, assuming her own version of events wasn't already the gentle way. If NBC had simply put her name on that succession list in the first place and avoided the entire chain of events. But that kind of speculation misses the point of why the story still gets told more than 3 decades later. It endures because it captures something true about how fragile even the deepest professional relationships can be when ego, ambition, and public reputation collide, and because it's a reminder that in an industry obsessed with loyalty, the harshest punishments are often reserved not for those who fail, but for those who dare to try building something of their own. Johnny Carson never spoke about Joan Rivers publicly again after the ban took effect, and by all accounts, he meant every bit of that silence. Joan Rivers spent the rest of her life talking about almost everything, including him, turning even her deepest professional wound into material, into memoir, into the kind of unflinching honesty that had made her a star on his stage in the first place. In the end, maybe that's the most fitting legacy of all.